Hello, welcome to Veeam's Industry Insights once again. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I'm Jeff Reichard on Veeam's product strategy team, and I'll be hosting our live stream today. And I am actually on the road. I am joining you from San Francisco, where Veeam is presenting at the 2024 RSA Security Conference. I am delighted to be joined today, speaking of security, by Ray Heffer, who is Veeam's America's Field Chief Information Security Officer, or Field CISO. Ray, why don't you introduce yourself, and why don't you tell us a little bit about your previous experience and what your role here as Veeam's America's Field CISO involves?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So it depends how far you want to go back. I won't go too far back into history, but first off, I just want to say actually that people in cybersecurity come from all sorts of backgrounds, from traditional IT to even those that work, come from legal, for example. I come from that more traditional background. I started as a Unix administrator in the mid-90s, and the reason for this video, by the way, it was in 1997. I saw this video. It went viral over email, and it was called Bad Day. And I'm going to touch back to this a bit later. But yeah, if I skip ahead 20 years or so, I spent 10 years of my time at VMware. In fact, the last few years as a field CISO at VMware prior to joining Veeam. But I've worked for government regulators in the UK as a security consultant for an internet service provider. So had many different roles, but yeah, certainly the more traditional background. What I would say, Veeam, the role of a field CISO is an interesting one. You mentioned Chief Information Security Officer, which I have in the title, and I have the same background and the same credentials as many CISOs, such as the CISSP, but the role itself is customer facing. And full transparency, I'm part of a sales organization. But the way I like to see it, it's part of an advisory and thought leadership role. And I love to do what I do, doing things like this, presenting keynotes, roundtables, having discussions with other CISOs, and and very much looking forward to Veeam as well, which is coming up soon.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. As we just saw in that little video up front. Well, so you've had cyber leadership roles. You've worked at VMware, which is certainly extremely relevant for a lot of Veeam customers. Let's talk about what your experience has been since you came to Veeam. How does the experience that you've had, the security background that you have, factor into the conversations that you're having nowadays with organizations that are looking Veeam and considering if we're a good choice for their data center?
Yeah, I think first off, having a similar background really helps. So I was actually a Veeam customer in 2008 when I worked for the government regulator. This is before VMware. Wow. That really helps. I actually did a fireside chat recently with a CISO in Canada. And as far as our career path is concerned, we certainly share the same battle scars, to put it that way. And I also found out he has a love for Star Trek, as do I. I'm a huge fan. Next Generation, I must add. But yeah, on a more serious note, I think having that shared experience allows me to have an empathetic approach. And you mentioned VMware, just look at the changes we're seeing in the industry right now. The acquisition of VMware by Broadcom, I'm sure you've heard there's price increases and all sorts of things going on. But from a CISO perspective, what we're now dealing with is environments shifting to other platforms, perhaps the cloud. So they really need to be in lockstep with the infrastructure teams, even procurement. Just going back to the government regulator I mentioned, I was responsible for security, and I remember implementing ITIL as a framework. And 17 years ago, my relationship with the procurement was key, even during that process. So even today, I think it's very important to work with other departments, infrastructure teams, procurement. That helps mitigate against shadow IT, for example.
Right. That makes a ton of sense.
And just to extend from that,
yeah, go ahead.
Just want to add some more flavor to that. One of the things we're seeing in our ransomware trends report from last year, and obviously we've got another report due soon, is just this disconnect between cybersecurity teams and IT operations. And I think that's really a massive driving force behind my role, because that's not intentional, but things have evolved now where, look at backups, they're being targeted by threat actors. They're the last line of defense, but it hasn't typically been in the remit of the security team or the CISO. So I think it's very important to bring those together. Obviously, we've seen that in our research, but I'm also seeing that in conversations as well.
Yeah, that's not a surprise to hear at all. That's not a surprise to hear at all. So when you hear folks asking you questions when you're talking with CISOs or when you're talking with CIOs or backup teams, what kind of things are concerning people? What kind of questions are you hearing from organizations we're talking to about Veeam?
Yeah, I think that really depends. Yeah, security teams are really at all different stages. So, the questions can vary greatly. Take zero trust, for example. You may have seen if you search me up online, you'll see I talk about the hero's journey. In fact, I've got a slide on this. Let me just skip to that. There's a graphic there. The reason I say it's a hero's journey is, like a hero's journey, we need a map. We need a way of navigating. I'm a huge fan of the CISA zero trust maturity model for such a way of navigating. And some of the questions I get, for example, are how do we get started with zero trust? To more mature organizations that they've already fully adopted the framework, but they may be struggling with a certain area. And what I like about the CISA model is it presents you with 5 pillars. You have the user, the application, the device they're using, the network, and then the data. And something I'm seeing in the questions I get is around data, around classification and tagging, but then also backup and recovery. And even CISA's own maturity model hands you off then and passes you along to a NIST guidance. So I think there's more work to be done. But the main concern as well, I'm seeing from customers, just sort of shifting gears, is generative AI, or more accurately, large language models. Is this increasing the threat landscape? Is this increasing, the risk to organizations? I think just AI, we could talk for hours on that just alone. Red Canary, another trends report they released, I think it's the threat detection report from 2024. They actually highlight this, and it's a great read, by the way. But one of the things they summarize, which I completely agree with, is that generative AI is certainly more of a benefit to us as defenders than it is to the threat actors. I think time will tell. I hope that's the case. Maybe we'll learn more during RSA this week.
There's certainly no lack of sessions on the whole impact of AI, both from the offense and the defense side, for sure. So let's expand on that just a little bit. Are there any surprises in the conversations that you're having with organizations? I mean, I know I still have conversations with customers where I'm a little surprised at things maybe that they haven't done yet in 2024 or timelines they're looking at. What do you find surprising in talks you have with customers these days?
Yeah, I'd say nothing too groundbreaking. Most recently, actually, I was surprised to hear from a customer that actually had to respond to what they thought was a ransomware attack, but it was fake. We don't often hear about those, but I think they're just as important to learn from. I think the uncertainty with that is worse. Did the encryption process not work, that the attacker put in place? Did they really have data exfiltrated, for example? I think the way to approach that is, the correct answer should be yes, just assume it's a real attack, always assume a breach. But my advice to those customers is make sure they have well-rehearsed incident response playbooks and just treat it the same. But I think what also surprises me is this isn't always the case. I was at an event recently and asked for a show of hands, who's integrating backup and recovery as part of their incident response process. And I wanted everyone to put their hand up, but I'd say 20% of the room did. So I think we've got some work to go. That's also a surprise, I think, today, especially with ransomware. And you've heard in the news, there's United Health, they paid a ransom. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but we have to have that baked into our incident response processes. We really do. But I think another important topic around surprises in conversations, and I'll be honest, this is a mistake I make, is we hear about threat actors, and I'm really guilty of this, is we immediately think of Russians, perhaps in their late teens, early 20s, living with their parents. But probably the most notorious group from Russia is Sandworm. In fact, I've got a book right here, the Sandworm book. Highly recommend that read, by the way. It's excellent. Advanced Persistent Threat 44, APT 44, they're known as. But they are far from teenagers living in their parents' basements. These are an integral part of Russia's military intelligence, attacking Ukraine. But then across the spectrum, read that how you will, we have Scattered Spider. They've got some various other names as well, but they're believed to be generally people in their late teens, early 20s, perhaps living with their parents, but mainly compromised of UK and US citizens. So we're seeing more sophistication with social engineering. Obviously, they're known for the attack on MGM and Caesar's Palace, which, by the way, the cost of that data breach, we're looking at hundreds of millions. In fact, IBM, I'm going to show you another slide here. IBM produce a report each year, the cost of a data breach report. And globally, the cost of a single data breach rose to $4.45 million US. The MGM Caesars is a very high number there. That's exactly. But that's concerning.
Well, that's very interesting. Let's take a quick break because I want to jump out. Felicia has queued up for us where we have folks joining from today. And I think let's take a quick look at the map. We have people dialed in from Mexico. We also have people dialed in from India for today's live stream. So that's great. Folks, please do put in the chat where you've joined us from. Love to hear from you. I don't think I said that up front, so my bad, but please do put in the chat where you're joining us from so that we can light you up on the map. So let's expand on this because I'm interested, Ray. The cost of a data breach, this is just a breach. This does not necessarily, it can include the cost of a ransom event, but basically this is for all of the associated costs to an organization from the data being stolen. Can you expand on what those risks are and what you're hearing from organizations about how they're thinking about that?
Yeah, I mentioned the fake ransomware attack, but again, that person I was speaking to was the CISO was genuinely concerned. Was the data actually exfiltrated? Perhaps that they didn't have the capability to encrypt it, but they still got a copy of it. Just to share the driving force for me, why I'm so passionate about this, is we talk about ransomware, data being encrypted and made public for a double extortion, for example, the cost of a data breach. But what this really comes down to is it's our data, it's our personally identifiable data, social security numbers, driving license, addresses. I don't want that out there at all. It's terrifying. But just to zoom in on this a bit, the thing that concerns me, and Mandiant, which you're going to hear from this week at RSA as well, they will talk about dwell time, how long an attacker is present on the system. This is slightly different. They're saying actually it takes an average of 204 days for organizations to identify that the breach occurred. And the important thing for CISOs as well is these metrics, MTTTI, so the mean time to identify, and then the mean time to contain a threat. So they're also key metrics that you need to be tracking.
No, you're exactly right. That's an interesting dynamic because I know in Kevin Mandia's keynote here at RSA yesterday, he talked about the average dwell time going way down. But what you're listing here, these multiple hundreds of days, this is a completely different number. This is data being stolen and how long, maybe the adversary was on the network for 5 days, but it took you another 199 days to realize that they'd been there and that they'd taken something.
For sure, yeah. And the the M Trends report, which you're talking about there, I think it reduced to 10 days global average. I think it was 13 the previous year. But yeah, that's to detect someone's on the network. But yeah, this is when a breach has happened, which is, I'm concerned, it's on the rise. We'll see what the next cost of a data breach report says, but you can see the trend. It's not looking healthy. That's another area that concerns me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let me ask as well, and obviously related to this, all of the numbers that we all see, the headlines that we see, have gotten a ton of attention from regulators, from governments around the world. And there's been some big news on that front that affects how a lot of organizations approach responding to a cybersecurity incident. Can you talk about how the updated regulatory environment, the changes we've seen lately and that are coming down the pike, are influeing the decisions of CISOs that you talk to?
Yeah, I think there's a ripple effect. In fact, before we get to the regulations, let's start from the top, and that's the president's executive order. I think it was about 3 years ago that came out. And these are more mandates, the mandating federal agencies to enhance their cybersecurity measures. But even in there, I mentioned zero trust. Zero trust is an integral part of that. And this, sure, it applies to federal agencies, but also applies to service providers, contractors, third parties. All of us aligned with those government agencies. And then as you look sort of trickle down, we have things like the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. That's evolved. Not too long ago, that version 2 of that came out. And okay, they simplified things, which was great, but rather than offering more of a guideline, it turned more into mandates again. So that's more of a Department of Defense model, but this is more mandates coming along. But in terms of regulations, just to answer the question, things like GDPR, I personally hope that something like that comes to the United States, but certainly other regions around the world are adopting something similar. But then we have things like in the US, at least the SEC, they have this 4-day rule of requiring public companies to disclose a cybersecurity incident. And I mentioned the Black Cat, Scattered Spider. There was an incident where they actually did double extortion or triple extortion, you could say, and threatened the victim that they're going to report them for missing the 4-day deadline unless they pay another ransom. So hey, maybe regulations are going to be used against us. I'm hoping that was a one-off as well.
Wow, talk about unintended consequences of regulation. I have read some speculation that maybe the SEC's reporting mandates, which you mentioned United Healthcare, they did report within the time that they were mandated to do under the new guidance. I've read some analysts saying that they believe that the increased rapid reporting requirement could force down ransom payments, because whereas before boards might have believed we can just sweep this under the rug and pay the ransom and no one will find out, if they have to report material events anyway, then it takes away a big incentive for paying ransoms. Is that what you're finding in conversations that you're having with folks?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it's important you mentioned the board there, because that's something else I'm seeing is the board being more involved in cybersecurity. If we wind the clock back a couple of years, they were sweeping things under the rug. The board wasn't even involved, and even the CISOs keeping that from the board, maybe not even presenting to the board. So I love to see today, and hopefully as we go forward, the board being more involved in cybersecurity. And I think that's very valid. The fact you have to do that reporting is not a get out clause to keep things quiet.
Yeah, I was interested this week that CISA has released draft guidance for so-called critical industries for the reporting period, which will be open through the summer. I took a look at the list of critical industries, and it is a bigger list than folks might expect. It extends to healthcare, it extends to IT, it extends to finance and banking. So it's not just in CISA's guidance around reporting, things that you might have thought of before, like the power grid or water purification. The list of potential targets, at least the way that the Department of Homeland Security, CISA agency, is thinking about it, is pretty broad. And if organizations are in that list, even if they're not publicly traded soon, they will have apparently the same kind of rapid reporting guidelines that we're seeing from the SEC right now. So a lot of interesting things to come on that front. We've been talking a lot about conversations you have with folks that are just now considering Veeam, and I don't know if when you talk with current Veeam customers, folks who maybe adopted us for VMware and are using us on-prem, but now they've moved to the cloud, are there any differences in the talks you're having with current Veeam customers versus with organizations that are looking at putting in a whole new data protection infrastructure?
Yeah, in fact, I was actually speaking to a current Veeam customer just a week or two ago, and I was talking similar conversation. We got into the features in 12.1, and we might get onto that in a moment. But he left the conversation in a matter of urgency, saying, "I need to make sure we have these features because I tend to do these talks, and it's quite scary. It's going to happen. Assume a breach, the world's going to end. It's quite gloomy." But there are countermeasures to that. And I'll give you an example. Veeam, being a market leader, unfortunately, in a way, is targeted even more by threat actors. And backup software and backup repositories are actually being targeted, not just for deletion, because obviously you want the ransom to be successful, but for exfiltrating the data. So you imagine a scenario where you have an backup admin account compromised, and they redirect to a compromised Amazon S3 bucket, for example, to exfiltrate the data. In fact, at RSA last year, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this, they call this living off the land, using existing tools, not so much hacker tools. There's tools like DNS Cat, which are more sophisticated, why do that if they've got tools they can already use, that are already implemented and go undetected? But it's safe to say the conversations I'm having with potential Veeam customers is we have mitigations against that. So that's where I see genuine excitement is, well, we need to do this. We need to make sure we're on the latest version, and we need to be doing these things. It reminds me of the film War Games, right? At the beginning of the movie, there's 2 officers in the room, and there's 2 admins needed, 2 officers to launch the missile. Now, we're not launching missiles, but we want to make sure backups can't be deleted, new ones being created, and we have features like 4 eyes admin protection. So it sounds small, but that's a mitigation against a really significant threat.
But that's a perfect lead-in, because I know that since version 12.1 of the Veeam data platform were released back in December, we've had a ton of customer interest in some of the new security features. You've mentioned the so-called 4 eyes authentication to prevent destructive actions on your backup repository or backup infrastructure. Can you talk, if folks are not familiar with some of the enhancements that we put in v12.1, about some of the other things that are catching organizations' attention when you talk about them?
Yeah, so that's interesting because some of the talks I do may be primarily around zero trust. If you look at some of the low-hanging fruit, there's MFA, where we have that inline malware detection. And I said earlier, backups, they are really the last line of defense. And this is coming back to this integration. We need to integrate security teams and get security leaders talking with IT operations in aspects where they wouldn't typically have been talking. So rather than just thinking, okay, we need to recover from, say, a ransomware incident, the ability to carry out inline malware detection, have Yara rules, find the last clean backup. Because going back to this slide, which is still up now, how long is the attacker there? They could have infiltrated and installed some malware which may have gone undetected by EDR. You have to assume that just because it gets to backup that we're not all clean. You've got to have defenses in every stage. It's almost like the secure DevOps strategy. So they're just a few features that come to mind. But I think going back to the customer, I have seen genuine excitement from CISOs because they want to speak to the IT teams. Now we have this capability. At the end of the day, we need this capability being that last line of defense. Yeah,
absolutely. Actually, we had great news just last week where we released the Splunk app for Veeam, so that it will be possible now for Veeam to populate events in Splunk from the backup infrastructure, so that your security analysts who are used to looking at their Splunk dashboards and their Splunk fields to see what's going on in the environment from logs can get that updated in real time, and without having to do a lot of pre-configuration, because the Splunk app is there. It basically just plugs into the existing Splunk infrastructure. That's another thing that I've found in talks I've had has been powerful lately. We've been investing a lot at Veeam in our security integrations as well. And I know, Ray, you have a big security background. For folks who maybe haven't looked at the fact that Veeam events can now be exported in syslog format, can you let folks know sort of what the value is of having all kinds of Veeam events instantly available to Splunk or to your SIEM management system?
Yeah, I kind of touched on this before, but just think about what the backup's for. First of all, we need to know as a business, I'm going to go at high level now, what are our critical assets? Data is obviously, I'd say, a pretty critical asset here. And if we're backing it up, we're backing up our most critical data. And if you think without this, in the past, where backups treated as just this thing that runs, I remember back in the day, just offsite backups meant me going home with a tape in my bag. I'm glad we're not there today. But having this integration, you mentioned Splunk. This is the SIM that the security teams use, what they're looking at every day. We shouldn't have any gaps. And I think one of the concerns that we hear a lot is gaps. I mentioned shadow IT, but also gaps. If we're touching business critical data, we need to know. As I mentioned, the inline malware detection. We need to see these type of alerts, and not treat it after the fact, which backup and recovery had been that way in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I love your example of needing to think from a security context of how the backup application is being used, possibly to exfiltrate data. I know when in my career, have run enterprise backups, I would have a dashboard, I would get emails, and I would look for job fail, job hung, things like that.
Yeah,
A successful restore wouldn't necessarily get a backup admin's attention. That's not a red light, that's a green light, right? That's something that went the way it was supposed to.
exactly.
But it might be absolutely the case that my security analyst looking at Splunk would very much want to know any out of place restores that are carried out in my environment to make sure that the backup infrastructure with a stealthy adversary who's living off the land isn't being used to exfiltrate data in a way that looks otherwise normal and isn't detectable. So yeah, that kind of integration is really interesting. It's also something that has interested folks that I've talked to, and you might have seen the same thing, that Veeam can also now, via the incident API, get alerts from the security infrastructure, if something's happening, and give commands to Veeam. That kind of integration, security is a team sport, and that kind of integration comes in very, very handy. So let's move on a little bit and I know we're pretty well through, into 2024 now, but I'll ask you a last question. How do you see the rest of 2024 unfolding, just in 1 minute, from a security standpoint, Ray?
Well, that's $1 million question, but expecting my crystal ball. But I think, I mentioned this already. My concern generally in the threat landscape are threat actors combining forces. I mentioned scattered spider, UK, US, but they've gained some respect from the Russian threat actors as well. So that's an area to watch. Obviously, generative AI. We can't have a session without talking about AI. And I think, okay, we could talk about creating ransomware, but let's use this as a defender as well. This is going to be very exciting. What we can do with AI, but also just to finish off and touching back on your last point is the incident response API, the capabilities of Veeam and the security teams. This is why, from a strategic level, we need to bring these together. So when there's a tabletop exercise or running through an incident response scenario, let's not do this in isolation. We have the technology now. We just need the people and the processes together. We can't just do this with technology alone.
Yep. Perfect. Well, Ray, thank you so much. I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that our viewers, we had a great viewership today on the different platforms that our Industry Insights broadcasts on. I'm going to get my crystal ball now and look ahead just one day, because this week we're going to mix things up a little bit with our Tech Bites broadcasts. Tomorrow, May 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, please join Michael Cade, Rick Vanover, and Mark Lavie for a special Tech Bites that we're going to broadcast live from the Red Hat Summit in Denver. We may have a product announcement coming for you there, so please tune in, don't miss it. On Thursday, we will have our normal Tech Bite session. That'll be Thursday, May 9th at noon Eastern Time with Rick Vanover. And Rick will be talking with Veeam strategic partner Involta about data center density and PUE advice. And then finally, next Tuesday, May 14th, Industry Insights will be back. We will have Veeam's Leah Trushnecki and Jason Buffington talking about backup as a service and disaster recovery as a service. And we'll have insights from this year's Cloud Protection Trends Report. So thank you very much for joining us, Ray. Again, thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation this morning. And again, there's a lot of good Veeam Tech Bites and Industry Insights coming in the near future. So please tune in for our next live stream. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.